Unstoppable, a book by W.P. Thrift, read by name redacted, Chapter 3, The Immortal Count. Ages ago, long before written history, when the lore of the old days were told only by the bards reciting poetry in quaint, distant villages throughout the land, there existed a rarely spoken of tale of an ancient count who'd first walked in this world before the primordial ooze of creation had fully receded. Only hushed whisper dared to murmur this story, for it was believed it be cursed, causing a blight to fall upon any who spoke in it loud enough for the ghosts of those he cruel count had slain to hear. Being reminded of their tormentor drove those old spirits into a vengeful haze. This count was said to have treaded land before any mortal, and came from the soup of creation to herald the coming of the great old gods who'd spewed forth existence from non-existence. In time, mortals gained the capacity to understand his words, and all who ignored them were slain. For ages he ruled the world of mortals with an iron fist, until the days of the great archdemon came, and the old gods were forced to use their herald as the eternal jailer of the great demon. While the count would vanish from the lands, his legends would live on, haunting the nightmares of children for all time. Long after his name was forgotten, he remained as a figment within the global cognition of reality, an archetype form of terror. He could never truly be forgotten. Count von Dread, the herald of the great old ones and jailer of beasts, seeking to eternally damn humankind. He only held back this destruction because the end of the humans were for his masters alone. It would be their great privilege that no others may seize. Elizabeth strode steadily down the ancient corridors of Count von Dread's last great castle. At one time it had been the newest of castles, carved primarily from stone from the heart of a mountain which had been hollowed out to support the vast network of corridors and prisons which made up this hidden estate, which sat high atop of the world, above the clouds, never visible from the lands below where humans continued to live. Ghosts wailed down the hallway, visible only to the brave knight with her sack full of loot. A monocle she wore, recently retrieved from her burlap sack, discovered within some invisible puzzle she'd stumbled across, allowed he to see the phantasms which howled and moaned in their eternal terror, captured within these walls, unable to leave. Lucia giggled, and Elizabeth glanced down at her with a stern look. Lucia quickly quieted, looking away at the floor. She ran her eyes along the splintered patterns of stone on the ground, each rock put in place by slave labor, slaves whose bodies were down entombed within this dominion forever. Lucia cracked another smile, letting out another unintentional laugh. "What's so funny, child?" Elizabeth demanded. "That monocle looks funny on you," Lucia admitted. "Only a fool concerns themselves with their own appearance. I wear it for practical applications, not for fashion." "Only a fool concerns themselves with their own appearance." Those words hit Lucia hard as she looked down at her dress. It had been the only nice thing she'd owned in this world before her kidnapping had ruined it. A lady Lucia had thought was nice had given it to her a week ago. Before then, she'd had only tattered rags to wear, rags which had begun to decay from exposure to the elements. What Lucia hadn't known was that the lady had considered calling the guard on all the street urchins she'd discovered under the bridge leaving town, to have them all rounded up and quartered. It wasn't kindness that made her act otherwise, but vanity. She hated the smell which wafted over from the execution grounds any time a new mass grave needed to be dug. It was unpleasant. So instead of having all the children slain, she rounded up second-hand goods from her neighbors, clothes they were going to burn because they were old or had lice or worse, and went down under the bridge to order the children to dress themselves up nice. She wanted them to not be an ugly blight on this town, if she were going to tolerate their existence. Lucia had picked out the loveliest dress of them all, the nicest she'd ever seen. She had no idea of its history, and wouldn't have cared if she did. She quickly took a bath in a nearby stream, enduring the freezing cold water and scummy rocks which sliced into her feet while she stood on them to clean herself up enough to feel worthy of these garments. Once she'd changed into them, her heart melted at her own appearance reflected back at her in the water. "I'm so pretty," she thought, eternally grateful to the woman who'd provided this to her. She began to cry at the very sight of herself, overwhelmed with joy. 1 week later, filth and mold clung to the now fairly tattered dress. It was muddy, virtually none of the white still visible on it. This castle had taken the one nice thing she had in the entire world away from her. Lucia looked back up at Elizabeth to ask if it was really so foolish to just want to wear a clean dress, and noticed that Elizabeth had taken off the monocle when she wasn't looking. Elizabeth noticed this and snorted. "Don't give me that look. I didn't need it anymore. It served its purpose." Lucia couldn't help but crack another smile. The more upbeat mood was intruded upon by Sam abruptly screaming. Elizabeth didn't even flinch, as she was used to the wails of the damned splitting through the air wherever she went, but Lucia practically hit the ceiling, she jumped so high. "Why haven't we fled this place? We're going straight towards the heart of this evil castle, we are," Sam cried out. "If you want to leave, leave. I'm not your kidnapper. You can go if you want," Elizabeth replied. Sam looked back. The way they came, think the zombie dogs that got that woman are still roaming free? "Didn't Sir Elizabeth here slay all of those?" John asked. "No. Dogs which got the lady lurked the other way. Ones she zapped were trapped in a room. I can't handle this. I'm going to turn gray from stress." Sam had a long-winded explanation for why they should leave now, and how she had effectively kidnapped him by not escorting him straight to the entrance where he'd be safe. Elizabeth tuned him out entirely, as she was more focused on not falling for Count von Dread's illusions. She pressed through several walls which were mere figments of the imagination, and tread up many flights of steps before realizing they were repeating in an endless loop. This was resolved by walking backwards up them for a while. "How did you know to do that?" John asked her. "It's like the 10th time I've seen enchanted stairs like those. Kind of an old trick at this point." Elizabeth spoke with the utmost of reluctance, as this was the 5th time she'd had to explain that to someone in the past year. "How did you figure it out the first time?" Lucia asked her. Elizabeth's brow rose slightly. "Ah, now that's a more intelligent question to ask. You see, You'll tell me which one of these magic corridors leads me out of here," Sam barked at her, interrupting. "That window is safe to jump out." Elizabeth pointed to a random opened window. "You'll pass safely all the way to the ground below." Sam went and looked out the open window, looking down at the dizzying heights. They were inside of a tower now, one which branched far out from the castle, reaching out over the forests far below like a wicked arm. It was an impossible architectural structure which was only held together by magic. He began to raise a knee up to the edge of the window, contemplating taking her word for it and jumping. "Hold on!" John shouted, grabbing Sam by the arm and pulling him away from the window. "Lady Knight, you said you would keep us safe if we were with you. How dare you try and trick that nitwit into jumping to his death?" "I said no such thing," Elizabeth replied. "I said I could only protect you if you were near me. I also told you lot that I don't care if you live or die. Stay near me and stay safe, or run off and get yourselves killed. Your choice, but do not try and order me around. Never tell me where to go, understand me?" "You lied to me," Sam gasped. "You just lied to me, tried to get me killed." "I did not lie to you." Elizabeth shot him a glare which froze his blood and made his heart begin to jackhammer with terror. "I said you'd pass safely to the ground, and you would have. It's once you reach the ground that problems would arise." Sam gulped. Thinking about what she said literally, he realized she had been entirely honest with him, in a sense. Without another word, Elizabeth continued up towards the top of the tower. It would end with a massive doorway with 8 keyholes lining a series of elaborate golden devices and chains which held the door shut. Drawing 8 keys out of a small pouch she had at her side, keys which she'd gathered from all over the castle before she'd arrived at the room where Lucia and the others were held captive, she unlocked every device, unsealing the door. She pushed it open, and on the other side was a room that was certainly too large to be held up by the increasingly thin spiraled stairway up the tower which had laid here. The room spanned at least 100 yards, with the menacing presence of Count von Dread himself sitting on a throne made up of human bones at the far end. Count von Dread was bald, had pale skin, beady glowing red eyes, and a serpentine slit across his face which opened to a maw of many needle-like teeth. He wore an elaborate series of layered trench coats and cloaks, giving what in reality a very thin body a much heftier appearance. "Dare ye intrude upon the presence of the herald of the old gods?" Count von Dread's voice thundered across the room, making Lucia and John fall to their knees in terror, and Sam forced his sphincter shut with all his might to avoid voiding his bowels right there on the spot. Sam's efforts were unsuccessful. Elizabeth behaved as though she was daftly unaware of von Dread's presence as she walked straight into the room, unhindered by his ear-splitting words and soul-rending presence. The knight knew precisely where all the best loot would be kept because of the unusual layout of the room. The room itself looked like it had been melted from the inside very recently, as globs of melted steel created patterns very similar to swashes of washed-out sand on the beach all around the floor and all down the walls. Brand new furniture of wood, steel, and brass had been moved into this room recently, but it was still in the process of being redecorated. That meant all of the treasure chests, magically sealed and protected against whatever destroyed the room before, were now very visible and out in the open. A once closed off space where perhaps a false bookshelf had sat to disguise a nook containing a chest was now wide open, all traces of the previous blockage long dissolved. Elizabeth walked straight to that chest and opened it, and began to toss things out of it she deemed worthless. "Liz, help!" Lucia cried over to her as she saw Count von Dread rising up from his throne and starting to tread over towards the intruders. "Why do I always have to help?" Elizabeth rounded on her, shouting across the distance which had opened between her and her companions when she'd walked over to the treasure. "Why can't you help me for once? Maybe, I don't know, find me something that I could hawk off at a high price?" Lucia had a million thoughts running through her mind, but then she took a deep breath and decided to trust Elizabeth instead of fighting against her. She walked over to a nearby mahogany table, a very new one which could have even finished being polished this week, and began to examine the utensils on it. "Oh, what a lovely chalice," Lucia said, seeing a golden chalice adorned with bright rubies sticking out in each of the cardinal directions on the side of the cup. "Unhand the sacred chalice of the old gods, you foolish mortal," Count von Dread shrieked. "Yeah, ew. That thing's so tacky," Elizabeth said while walking over to the table. Elizabeth reached Lucia as von Dread reached the halfway point across the room. The other two men remained closer to Elizabeth than to the door, but they were still a good 30 yards within the room. It felt like it was too late to leave now, but they were both eyeballing the exit pretty hard. "You don't like it?" Lucia asked her, staying focused on the night and trying to shut out the image of the Count rapidly approaching her. The Count moved across the room like a phantom, not moving his legs as he walked. "The vendors don't have much coin for gold anymore. I kind of ruined the price of that by selling off a whole bunch of it recently, so I'd rather find something with enchanted powers. Wizards will still buy that crap at a really high price, so vendors that act as the middlemen in those exchanges will empty their registers to me if I can bring something nice in." "So, could I have it?" Lucia asked. "The chalice? Oh, well, sure. I wasn't going to take it. It's worthless, like I said, and it'd be too tacky to use it myself in my own house. So gaudy yuck." Count von Dread had stopped 20 yards away from them, and was channeling an ancient magical spell between his hands now. He didn't know who these intruders were, but he deemed them all worthy of extermination given how little respect they were paying him. "Wait, hold on," John shouted. "Why does she get to keep treasure? Why don't I get to keep the chalice? You elitist pricks are all the same, you are. Keeping all the wealth to yourselves. Don't think I don't recognize that dress you're wearing, little girl. You must come from a rich family, don't you? You're both elitist scum." "The chalice is mine to do with what I want," Elizabeth replied, rolling her eyes at his complaints. "What?" Count von Dread's fury was erupting now. "No, ITS my treasure. Die, die, die. The lot of you die." The ancient Count released a sudden stream of miasma into the room which erupted out of his hands and into the air like steam from a coffee pot, completely with a very loud whistle as it blew upwards towards the ceiling before rapidly crashing back down. With an extraordinary elegance and all the grace of a lynx pouncing on its prey, Elizabeth whipped open the bag and snatched the ring she'd taken from the wizard earlier out of it. This ring, which she'd calculated, was a protection he'd made specifically to counter his own master's deadliest attack. The wizard had been conjuring potion after potion in an effort to develop a poison that could kill his own master, and had been conjuring wards to protect himself in the brief seconds between poisoning von Dread and the Count's final dying gasp. Her intuition proved accurate as upon placing on the ring she felt an invisible barrier extend around herself, preventing the miasma from reaching her. The miasma which immediately melted the throne of bones the Count had sat upon, melted what little new furniture he'd brought into the room, melted everything the same as it had so many times before. He was forced to constantly redecorate his room every time he felt like conjuring his acidic miasma to wipe out intruders. "We're going to die!" Sam freaked out. "No, stay near me. You'll all be safe," Elizabeth said. Lucia immediately ran and hugged Elizabeth around her waist tightly, clinging to her plated leg armor with a white-knuckled death grip. As much as she'd tried to shut out the horrors all around her and let the night's courage serve as her own courage and confidence as well, she was still very young, and had a very hard time coping with the world burning and melting down around her. John remained close as well, seeing from the way the floor bubbled nearby precisely where the barrier ended. Sam, meanwhile, backed away from Elizabeth. Count von Dread walked steadily towards her once more now that he'd cast his spell, and he drew a long rapier which he planned to lop her finger off with, releasing the ring from her hand and breaking the barrier, which would cause her shield to fail and her life to be forfeit. "So what, I'm safe if I'm near you, except for when I'm not?" Sam asked, his voice quivering. "Just like the window, right? I'm safe when I'm falling, except for when I hit the ground? You'll not fool me again. I won't let myself be killed by some crazy old sorcerer because of your tricks." "Sam, don't!" John shouted at him, but his new acquaintance wouldn't listen. Turning, staring across the 30-odd yards between himself and the door, Sam sprinted out of the barrier, intending to make it through the miasma and out the door to safety. The scream which followed would haunt Lucia's dreams for the rest of her life. It was an inhuman, animalistic scream which was ear-splittingly loud, despite being muffled by gurgling buckets of blood as Sam's organs liquefied from the very first sniff of miasma. His skin boiled right off his muscles seconds after leaving the barrier, and the splatter of gore across the floor evaporated into a red fog within seconds, a fog which wafted up towards the now burning rafters at the ceiling of the room. Charred bones sizzled on the floor, sparking flashes all across them as the marrow spat out between cracks and bursts of light and energy. Lucia mercifully missed seeing the horror show, but his scream was well recorded in her psyche. She gritted her teeth and cried into Elizabeth's side between gasps of air. Grimacing at the horror spectacle, and then glancing down with a more sympathetic look towards Lucia, Elizabeth turned to face Count von Dread, who was now close enough to smell her. He'd closed the distance so much that he'd stepped within the barrier itself, outside of his own miasma. "Your death shall serve as a warning to all that. BLAAAAH." The poison that the wizard had developed specifically to slay the ancient von Dread was not used. Elizabeth didn't need it. An enchanted dagger, not terribly unlike 5 others she had in her burlap sack, had cracked straight through the skull of Count von Dread. It pierced not only his mortal brain, but his immortal soul, ripping apart his attachment to this moral realm forever, and banishing him back into the darkness from which he came. Elizabeth couldn't recall where she'd looted that dagger from, only that she heard it could pierce into the ethereal plane. She had a thought that day, "I bet I could slay the immortal Count with this," then added ransacking this castle to her to-do list. This was just one of 10 ancient places she had to visit listed on her calendar for this month. The miasma had departed. The way towards the exit was open. John screamed for them to get out of here, and Elizabeth roundly ignored him. "But why? Why can't we leave?" "The treasure in here is magically protected from his own miasma, see? I can still plunder through all of it and loot the best of the pickings." "Lucia still care to help me?" Elizabeth asked her. Lucia had fallen to the floor on her knees, holding the chalice with both hands and staring at it intensely. She shook uncontrollably. "Come on, I'll let you pick out something else nice for yourself." Elizabeth tried to put on a happy face to cheer the girl up. Lucia didn't respond to her in any way, so Elizabeth just sighed, dropping the fake smile. "Whatever, do what you want." Elizabeth returned to casually exploring around the room for loot, while Lucia sat on her knees less than a yard away from the dead Count's body.